In March 1651, the Dutch Navy anchored off the rugged coast of the Isles of Scilly. Admiral Martin Tromp officially declared war after the islanders refused to pay for 12 plundered ships. However, the two nations simply forgot to fire a single shot for 300 years. This massive administrative oversight resulted in a 335-year death match. Welcome to the 335 Years' War. A conflict so legendary for its laziness, it makes a nap look like a marathon. It was not a Cold War, it was a forgot to hit send on the email war. While most wars involve, soldiers and explosions, this one involved a lot of dusty paperwork and the collective amnesia of an entire continent. To understand how a global superpower gets ghosted by a group of islands that are mostly populated by puffins and confused tourists, we have to go back to 1651. Back then, the Dutch were the biggest maritime ballers on the planet, and they were extremely annoyed that their stuff kept getting swiped by pirates. But instead of just filing an insurance claim or venting on social media, they decided to pull the ultimate petty move and declare war on a specific zip code. It is the historical equivalent of getting cut off in traffic and trying to sue the driver's entire extended family. Little did they know, this legal temper tantrum would live through the rise and fall of empires, the Industrial Revolution, and both World Wars. We are diving into the ultimate ghosting story, where an entire country forgot they were supposed to be invading a vacation destination. This is history's longest, weirdest, and most statistically peaceful mistake, where the only thing that under the massive ruffs and fancy clogs of the 17th century lay a grudge so dedicated it lasted until the era of neon leg warmers and synthesizers. This is how you stay at war for 334 years without ever actually showing up to the fight. I picture this. It is 1651, and England is currently a massive dumpster fire known as the English Civil War. It is basically a toxic group chat, where the parliamentarians and the Royalists are constantly fighting over who gets the crown. The Royalists, led by the soon-to-be decapitated king's biggest fans, are losing badly, so they retreat to the Isles of Scilly. These are basically a bunch of rocks off the coast of Cornwall that currently have more seagulls than people. But they were not just birdwatching. No, they were practicing their best pirate impressions, raiding any Dutch ship that dared to carry expensive spices or fancy clogs through the English Channel. Enter Admiral Martin Tromp, a man who looked like he was born wearing a rough collar and a permanent scowl. Tromp was the MVP of the Dutch Navy, and he was absolutely fed up with these royalist. He cruised up to the islands with a fleet of warships, demanding that the Royalists pay for the 28 ships they had hijacked and the emotional damage caused by their lack of manners. The Royalists, possessing the confidence of a guy who just lost his entire kingdom but still wants to pick the restaurant, basically told since Tromp could not declare war on all of England, because he was actually vibing with Oliver Cromwell's parliamentarians, he did the most petty thing in maritime history. On March 30th, 1651, he pulled the ultimate petty move and formally declared war on the Isles of Scilly specifically. It was the geopolitical equivalent of punching someone's mailbox, because you are mad at their dog. But the most shocked Tromp was not just being dramatic for the sake of it. This was a high-stakes legal loophole designed to let the Dutch legally seize Royalist ships without starting a world war with the rest of Britain. He treated the Scilonian archipelago like a sovereign nation of pirates, which is hilarious considering the population was about 3 farmers and a very confused sheep. The Scilonian Empire was now officially at odds with one of the most powerful naval forces on the planet. Tromp sat there for 3 months, probably waiting for someone to apologize or send out a plate of scones. But the parliamentarian forces under Admiral Robert Blake, let's call him Bobby B, showed up and forced the Royalists to surrender in June 1651. At this point, the Dutch fleet realized their enemy had just been evicted by their friends. Since their beef was technically with the islands and not the new landlords, Tromp decided it was time to head home for some pickled herring. He sailed away, forgot to sign any peace treaties, and basically left the stove on for the next 3 centuries. He essentially ghosted an entire war after declaring it, leaving the islands in a state of perpetual aggression that nobody would notice for 335 years. It was the perfect military strategy. Declare war, wait for someone else to do the fighting, go home, and literally never mention it again while your legal paperwork gathers dust in a forgotten basement. So, after only 3 months of aggressive staring and menacingly waving reparations bills, the Dutch fleet finally took the hint and sailed back to the land of windmills and high-quality tulips. Admiral Tromp basically pulled the ultimate 17th century ghosting move. He left the Isles of Scilly in his rearview mirror, or his decorative brass-looking glass, and headed home to tell the Dutch States General that he'd totally handled it. Meanwhile, Robert Blake and his parliamentarian crew swooped in like a group of angry property managers and reclaimed the islands for Oliver Cromwell. This created the mother of all legal loopholes. Because Tromp had specifically declared war on the Isles of Scilly and not the nation of England itself, the Treaty of Westminster in 1654, which ended the First Anglo-Dutch War, completely ignored our tiny archipelago. It was like a messy divorce where everyone forgot who officially owned the decorative garden gnome. The Dutch went home, the English went back to being miserable under Puritan rule, and the Cylonians went back to whatever it is people do on a pile of rocks in the Atlantic, probably counting sheep and praying for better weather. For the next 300-odd years, the world basically reset. We had the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution, the rise and fall of the British Empire, and 2 entire world wars, throughout all that time, while humanity was busy inventing the steam engine and the internet, the official legal status of the Scilly Isles remained unchanged. Generational memory is a funny thing. Eventually, the war became a piece of local folklore, a quirky campfire story told by Cylonian grandfathers to scare kids into eating their vegetables. Finish your porridge, or the men in wooden shoes will come for your soul. Except, nobody actually believed it was real. It was a clerical error buried in the archives of history, a ticking time bomb of paperwork that had been ticking since the days of musket fire and roughs. While the rest of the planet was evolving, this tiny corner of Cornwall was technically a combat zone, sitting in a state of terminal dormancy. It was the geopolitical equivalent of leaving your garage light on during a 300-year vacation and then wondering why the bill is so high. The Dutch naval brass had long since died off, replaced by bureaucrats who wouldn't know a Royalist privateer from a modern-day tourist. Yet the declaration of war sat there, collecting dust and technically authorizing a Dutch invasion that nobody was actually planning to launch. It was the safest, quietest, and most ironically peaceful war in the history of human stupidity. Just waiting for one guy with too much time on his hands. Enter Roy Duncan. The hero this story probably didn't deserve, but absolutely. It is 1985, and while the rest of the world is busy wearing neon leg warmers and listening to Wham, Roy, a local historian and the chairman of the Isles of Scilly Council, is hyper-focusing on the local rumor mill. For years, the Cylonians had this fun fact they would tell tourists over a pint of bitter. Crazy, right? Most people treated it like that one uncle who thinks he is an alien, entertaining but definitely full of it. But Roy was not most people. He was a man with a pen, a dream, and an alarming amount of free time. He decided to find out if this was just a tall tale to sell postcards, or if they were legitimately one bad day away from a Dutch naval holiday. Everything they believed up to this point was wrong. Roy did not just guess. He went straight to the source and challenged the ghost of history itself. He penned a letter to the Dutch embassy in London, basically asking, "Hey, super awkward question, but just checking for a friend." He probably expected a polite letter back, telling him to go touch grass and stop worrying about 17th century naval drama. Instead, the Dutch ambassador, a man with the magnificent name of Huydecoper, decided to play along. He did not just send a shrug emoji. He went full Indiana Jones on the National Archives. He started digging through layers of literal and metaphorical dust to find out why the Netherlands had been ghosting an entire archipelago for 3 centuries. What they found was the ultimate bureaucratic oopsie-daisy. The archives confirmed that Admiral Tromp had indeed declared war in 1651, and because the Scilly Isles were the only part of England the Dutch felt like fighting at the time, the General Peace Treaty from 1654 forgot to mention them. They were the legal equivalent of that one friend who gets left behind at a gas station during a road trip, and everyone just assumes they are in the back of the van. For 335 years, the paperwork had been gathering dust while the world moved on from wooden ships to space shuttles. Roy realized that his little island chain was not just a tourist trap. It was technically a combat zone. If the Dutch government ever had a really bad day and decided to get spicy, they had the technical legal green light to sail in and demand their 3 centuries of interest in the form of potatoes and ruffs. Roy knew he had to stop the war before someone actually remembered where they parked the cannons. He invited the ambassador over for a chat, not with a white flag, but with an invitation for the world's most overdue housewarming party. Fast forward to April 17th. 1986, and the atmosphere on the island of St. Mary is less Pearl Harbor and more the Great British Bake Off. We are talking about the grand finale of history's most lethargic cage match. The Dutch ambassador Roy Huydecoper, a man whose name sounds like an expensive brand of artisanal scissors, stepped off the boat to finally put the war out of its misery. He was greeted by Roy Duncan, the local historian and council chairman who had basically spent the previous year catfishing the Dutch government into a diplomatic date. The two of them sat down, pulled out a scroll that looked like it belonged in a museum or a very expensive LARP session, and signed the official peace treaty. No shots were fired, no blood was spilled, and I am happy to report that absolutely zero. It was the statistical miracle of warfare. A 3-century-long conflict with Huydecoper, clearly a man who mastered the art of the bureaucratic dry burn, joked to the assembled crowd that it must have been harrowing for the Scillonians to live every day knowing the Dutch Navy could have appeared on the horizon to shell them back into the Stone Age at any moment. Meanwhile, the islanders were probably more concerned with the local tide schedule. This treaty wasn't just a legal cleanup. It was a PR masterstroke. Today, the 1986 Peace Treaty is pinned up in Hughtown like a participation trophy for a game nobody actually played. It turned a bureaucratic oversight into a tourism goldmine, attracting history buffs who want to visit the only place on Earth where you can survive a 335-year war without getting a single scratch. But don't expect a massive payout for your historical trauma. Despite the 3 centuries of technical hostilities, the Dutch government isn't handing out reparations or free stroopwafels to the locals. You're still on the hook for your own snacks, and the islands are safely back to being a quiet archipelago. Even historians like Bowley argue the war never legally existed because a Dutch admiral didn't have the authority to declare war on a tiny cluster of rocks. But hey, why let as we approach the 40th anniversary of the peace in 2026, let this be a lesson to all of you. Always check your paperwork and keep your archives organized, or you might find yourself at war for 300 years just because someone forgot to hit reply all on a peace treaty. If you love history but hate boring textbooks, hit subscribe, or I am calling the feds. And let me know in the comments,